Thank you for joining us this cold, windy Thursday evening. I'm pleased to welcome tonight's speaker who comes to us from Ole Miss in the Magnolia State. Dr. Robert Colby is an assistant professor of history at the University of Mississippi's Department of History. He holds a BA in history from the University of Virginia here and received his master's at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His thesis examined the continuation of the domestic slave trade in Virginia during the Civil War. Robert Colby's PhD is also from UNC Chapel Hill. His dissertation, titled "The Continuance of an Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South," expands the scope of his master's thesis from the state of Virginia to the rest of the American South. This dissertation won the 2020 Society of American Historians Allen Nevins Prize for the best written doctoral dissertation on a significant subject in American history, and the 2020 Society of Civil War Historians Ann J. Bailey Dissertation Prize for U.S. Civil War era focused dissertations. Is that all correct so far? Perfect. All right. I first met Robert Colby virtually, as we all did, back in April 2021. At that point, the Office of Historic Alexandria had been working on the redesign of the Freedom House Museum at 1315 Duke Street for about a year. We had done our literature review, we've conducted new research, and at the time we were working on finalizing the exhibit text that's up in the museum now, selecting graphics and working with designers to pick out materials and paint colors. At that time, I came across a post on the internet that used one of the historic images from 1315 Duke Street, which happens often enough. I didn't really think much of it. But what caught my attention was that he also highlighted a man named George C. Smith. George C. Smith was the last individual to be enslaved at 1315 Duke Street. And I had just spent a month or two or four scouring every archive I could think of, trying to find more information about this one man. And I left with the conclusion that nobody in 120 years knew who he was. And when this panel went up, it would be new and contributing. And so when I saw on the internet somebody also talking about George C. Smith, I did what any normal person would do after reading a short 55-word social media post. I tracked down the author's work email address and sent him a giant wall of text with everything I've been able to learn about this man so we could compare notes. Dr. Colby's 2024 book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South, published by Oxford University Press, and the talk you were about to hear tonight, coincidentally, also titled An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South, broadens and expands his work on the American slave trade during the American Civil War. Here in Alexandria, our discussions of the domestic slave trade generally end on the morning of May 24th, 1861, when the Union Army crossed the Potomac River and occupied, or maybe in this setting more appropriately, liberated the city. Any remaining slave traders at that point had skipped town, the prisons and offices were confiscated by the Army, and the institution of slavery itself here in the city seemingly was placed on life support. But as you may be aware, or you will be in 5 minutes, the rebellion and the Confederacy would go on for 4 more years, and slavery and the domestic slave trade was maintained right up until the very end. His work will remind us that the struggle for freedom didn't magically conclude when a small army crossed the Potomac River in May of 1861. Please welcome with me Dr. Robert Colby.
Well, first, let me say how delighted I am to be here with you all tonight. As Ben said, I teach at Ole Miss right now, but I am from Fairfax. So this is as close to this is a hometown talk, and it's really great to see friends and family in the audience. It's really special to me. Thanks to Ben for suggesting this event, and to Jim and Audrey for working so hard to make it happen. And as Ben was saying, I just want to reiterate, we connected originally over 1315 Duke Street and its experiences during the war. It is one of not very many, only a handful of surviving extant slave trading sites that I'm aware of in the entire country. And so I'm delighted with the work that the historic office is doing to refurbish it, and when it reopens, it is open again. Okay, well, there's a caveat, but I commend it to all of you if you have not already been there. So it's at 1315. that I would like to start. As we just said, and you may have already been aware, Union forces occupied Alexandria on May 24th, 1861, which is less than 24 hours after Virginia made its secession official. That's the significance of that date, even though, well, we won't go into that, but Virginia's white population had ratified its secession only the day before. That's why the Union Army waited until that day to move into the city. As Union soldiers seized critical points in Alexandria, retreating Confederate cavalry made a stand on Duke Street, a stand anchored in part on a structure, a somewhat fortified structure on that street. You can see it in the back left of this image. The townhouse on the site, what remains of 1315 Duke Street, dates back to the 1810s, but in the 1820s, a slave trading outfit named Franklin and Armfield had rented the site, and over the course of the next decade, transformed essentially most of the block into a slave trading center, replete with jail, lodging, offices, and all the other accoutrements needed to keep large numbers of people there. Their paid agents scoured the Virginia countryside, going as far as Maryland and parts of what is now West Virginia, in acquiring people whom they brought to Alexandria, deposited in the jail, and Franklin and Armfield from there would either march them overland to cities like Natchez in Mississippi, or would put them on eventually one of the firm's 3 custom-built boats and send them by water to New Orleans. Franklin and Armfield is the most prolific slave trading firm in American history. After Franklin and Armfield retired in the late 1830s, they got out just before a massive financial crash would have put a serious damper on their business. For the next 2 and a half decades, other slave traders occupied the site, and when the Civil War began, on its facade were written the names Price and Birch. Price and Birch were local slave traders who were nevertheless tapped into larger networks, and had gained a certain infamy. James Birch, for example, was in part responsible for the kidnapping and sale of Solomon Northup. Back to May 1861. On that day, a Michigan regiment captured or drove off most of the Confederates. And I should say, this is John Armfield driving a group of purportedly 300 people. South, he's in the white hat lounging on the log. This is the structure as an artist perceived it in the 1830s. After the Michiganders drove off the Confederate cavalry, they entered 1315 Duke Street, in part looking for a place to put the prisoners that they had just taken. Inside, they found locked up, depending on which report one believes, 1, 3, or an indeterminately large number of enslaved people, a number that certainly included, we know, at least George C. Smith, whom the Michiganders freed, and George C. Smith would spend several months working with the 1st Michigan Infantry before eventually joining a black regiment raised during the Civil War and fighting to help the war that would help end slavery. After the U.S. secured the city, as Ben said, its slave traders fled. The slave pen became a stockade, first to hold Union soldiers, mostly people who had drunk a little too much in Alexandria. And also parts of the site became a hospital and sheltered other people, some of the thousands of freed people who flocked to Alexandria, where it was relatively safe. I should note on that, this is a total aside, you don't have to go that far out into Fairfax County for it not to be safe for formerly enslaved people. If you go into the city of Falls Church, for example, near where Columbia Baptist is, in 1864, I believe, Confederate raiders seized formerly enslaved people from that spot, dragged them out along the W&OD trail, and executed at least one person. So Alexandria, thousands of people arrive in Alexandria because it's relatively safe. Harriet Jacobs, author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, works among these people, helping them rise from enslavement, lobbying for their well-being. Abolitionists enter the slave pen. They take pictures that are widely circulated in the press. They confiscate locks, they confiscate chains, and they take them and use this to proclaim that this war is about ending slavery. The story of the Alexandria slave pen, of which 1315 Duke is the surviving remnant, then is therefore the story of the Civil War as a freedom struggle. But as been alluded to, it's not the end of the story. For example, Charles M. Price, one of the partners whose name was on the facade, does not, when the Union Army takes over Alexandria, give up slave trading. Instead, he moves to Culpeper and continues to practice the business. Another Alexandria slave trader is not here that May, Joseph Bruin, whose offices are survive at 1707 Duke. He's in New Orleans when the Civil War begins. He spends the first year of the Civil War continuing to trade people in New Orleans, and then when New Orleans falls, moves to Richmond after a brief stint in the old Capitol prison, and continues the business of slave trading there. Their actions point to an often overlooked part of the Civil War, one that few historians have discussed, in part because it's hard to see unless you start to look for it. But buried in Civil War letters, diaries, military documents, court records, newspapers, narratives, and recollections from formerly enslaved people lie traces of a massive commerce in humanity that white Southerners carried on during the Civil War. From facilities like this one, this is the auction house of Dickinson, Hill and Company in Richmond. It no longer exists. I-95 goes right above it right now. Though the precise number of people bought and sold during the Civil War can never be known, what is certain is that between Fort Sumter and Appomattox, white Southerners, predominantly Confederates, bought and sold thousands of people in a trade that played a significant role in shaping the experience of the conflict for everyone inhabiting the wartime South. And what I'd like to do tonight is to sketch that traffic and to suggest some of the reasons why, in the face of all the challenges raised by the Civil War, the slave trade survived, and what exactly that its persistence meant for people inhabiting the wartime South. Now, I've sort of alluded to the domestic slave trade. I've talked a bit about Franklin and Armfield. It might be helpful just to talk for another minute or two, though, about what exactly it was and what it meant. In essence, when we talk about the domestic slave trade, we're talking about the purchase, sale, and generally movement of enslaved people within the United States. It exists distinct from the better known and much larger Atlantic slave trade, and takes on its mature form after the US Congress bans Americans from participating in the Atlantic slave trade after 1808. In the decades between the Revolution and the Civil War, therefore, enslavers and a growing class of professional slave traders moved between 600,000 and 800,000 people from upper South ports like Alexandria, Baltimore, Washington, Richmond, even Norfolk, Charleston, move them from cities like that, where slavery had long been established, where there were significant enslaved populations, and they moved those people to the expanding cotton and sugar frontiers. Cotton is the most valuable thing the United States produces in the 1800s. It is one of the most valuable global commodities in manufacturing and international trade. And the United States is the epicenter of its production. Specifically, the American South is the epicenter of its production. And so enslaved people move in the company often, we think the majority of the time, in the company of professional slave traders from the Upper South to cities like Mobile, New Orleans, Natchez, Memphis, from which they're dispersed. Slave traders and individual slaveholders disperse them to wherever the most profitable cotton and sugar lands happen to be at that moment. Now, this human property moved through the slave trade brings considerable wealth both to those who bought enslaved property and to those who sold it. And this came not just through the cash crops that they grew, but through the actual value of enslaved people as financial assets. Because any enslaved person can theoretically be bought or sold, every enslaved person always carries a price. Every enslaved person has a price essentially baked into them, imprinted upon them. And that price can be translated into credit, into mortgages, and sometimes, in rare cases, securities. Enslaved people are securitized, which then disperses into sort of the wider world of American and Atlantic finance. All of this means that by the time of the American Civil War, enslaved people are the second most valuable form of property in the United States. They're worth more than all of the railroads. They're worth more than all the securities traded on Wall Street, worth more than all the manufacturing capacity of the United States. The only thing worth more than people in 1860 is land. The American slave market, in short, is big business. Now, despite the antebellum slave trade's vigor, for all that we've just outlined, the Civil War would seem to be an unlikely time to participate in the slave market. The onset of the war wrecks the American cotton export economy. By way of example, cotton exports from New Orleans dropped by 98% in the first year of the Civil War. So the commodity, the agricultural staple that had driven so much of the slave trade is functionally untradeable once the Civil War begins. Broader economic problems undermine the ability to do business in anything, much less something as valuable as people. Inflation is a huge problem in the Confederacy. This is a theme I'll come back to a couple of times tonight. But from the beginning of the war, just to get our minds around this, the Confederacy experiences averages about 10% inflation per month, which grinds a lot of businesses virtually to a standstill. And that's putting aside the fact that the persistent flight of enslaved people to Union lines and the fact that the United States increasingly, as the war goes on, makes freedom one of its war aims, imperils not only the slave trade, but the institution of slavery as a whole. And yet, Confederates engage in the slave trade from the war until the war's very last, and I mean that quite literally, very last days. Through the fact that it continues, through the fact that they can trade and enslave people from the beginning of the war to the end, they are able to adapt to the conflict and weather many of the crises it engenders. They're able to confront the onset of emancipation. And critically, I think, the slave trade allows them to try to construct the slaveholding future for which so many of them had gone to war in the first place. For enslaved people, meanwhile, the persisting slave traffic dramatically shaped the onset of freedom. And even as people moved towards liberation, often in the form of United States forces, the existence of the slave trade dragged many backwards into continued bondage and meant that freedom would have to wait until the very end of the war. It also meant that the effects of the slave trade on people's lives reverberated long after the guns fell silent. Now, I should say a little bit about the overall trajectory of the domestic slave trade during the Civil War. I mentioned this is something most historians have not looked at before. And generally, that's because if you look at places like Alexandria, Alexandria fits the narrative most historians have applied to the wartime slave trade. It ends almost immediately. And that is true up to a certain point. Alexandria provides a template that you can, broadly speaking, apply to the Civil War, which is to say that where Union forces go, the slave trade ends. Where the Union forces go, the slave trade ends. Because wherever there are United States soldiers or sailors, however reluctantly they do it, they do tend to abet enslaved people's efforts to win free of captivity. They don't always do it willingly. Sometimes they actively work against it. But as a general rule, it is fair to say that the U.S. military and the U.S. Navy, wherever they hold sway, wherever they project significant power, they help people win free of slavery. And as a result, their presence makes the slave trade simply too risky an economic endeavor. It's not worth, Sherman says something to this effect when he's commanding Memphis. Essentially, it's not worth buying or selling a person when that person could just walk across the street and become free, right? So wherever there are Union soldiers, wherever there are Union sailors, the slave trade as a general rule ends. And this is material, right? Because the Union forces make great advances, especially in the first year, 15 months of the war. That period sees major slave trading centers like Alexandria, Norfolk, Memphis, not quite Natchez, mostly Natchez, Nashville, and New Orleans, all erased from the Confederate slave trade. Union forces occupy all of them, and only the barest trace of the slave trade survives in those places. It's a little more complicated than this. There are exceptions, and that includes in places like the border states, Missouri, Maryland, and Kentucky. This is an advertisement from a September 1863 slave sale, I believe in Kentucky. In those places, the slave trade continues, and to some degree, it had to continue because slavery remains legal. One Union general, it's not just sort of legally based slave sales, though. One Union general estimated that slaveholders in Missouri and Kentucky alone had sold thousands of people back and forth between those two states. Marylanders, not far from we are, keep a close eye on slave markets in Virginia, and where they can, they move people across the Potomac River. Some Union soldiers even are involved in this process themselves. There are Union regiments that become famous for kidnapping people who had made their way to safe havens like Norfolk or Alexandria and smuggling them back across the lines. But generally speaking, it is fair to say that early from the first days of the Civil War, an unmistakable trend emerges, which is that where Union forces go, the slave trade dries up. But Union forces don't go everywhere. This is one of the maps from my book. The dashed lines sort of suggest the rough extent of Union control in the summer of 1862. And as you can see, it doesn't penetrate very far into most parts of the Confederacy. For most of the war, much of the Confederacy, if not most of the Confederacy, remains outside of Union control. And in these places, the domestic slave trade survives and even flourishes. A good example is in Texas, which is virtually untouched by Union forces for the entire Civil War. In Texas's wartime enslaved population absolutely explodes. In large part because slaveholders from the Mississippi River Valley, from Louisiana, Arkansas, parts of Missouri, and Mississippi flee ahead of Union occupation to Texas. When they get to Texas, they find that they can't necessarily employ the people that they've brought with them. They have to feed them, they have to clothe them. And as a result, many of these refugees will sell the enslaved people that they had brought with them. For Texans, this is a bonanza. Texans write jubilantly about acquiring people in Texas at what they consider to be bargain prices, scooping up the antebellum South's most valuable form of property for not quite pennies on the dollar, but close to it. And this process repeats in miniature in places like Georgia. Atlanta's slave markets boom during the Civil War, filled with people fleeing from the coast where Union naval and military forces threatened. Same goes for the interior of South Carolina and in Virginia as well. Virginia in some ways particularly because Union forces press on Virginia from multiple directions. In October 1862, for example, a Confederate war clerk in Richmond reported that virtually every train car arriving in the city was packed with people sent there for sale. We're starting to see, I think, some of the reasons why Confederates might want to sell people. But we also need to explain why Confederates would want to buy people during the Civil War. And I want to spend the rest of my time sort of sketching out some of the reasons and the ways in which these phenomena interact. I want to start by suggesting that in some ways, the Civil War itself creates a number of conditions that motivate Confederates to sell or to particularly to buy people. Historians argue all the time about whether the Civil War is a total war. That is to say, whether the entire resources of a society are mobilized to fight it. The Confederacy comes pretty darn close. By the end of the war, 80% of the military-aged men in the Confederacy will be in the Army, which means that there is an extraordinary amount of work that has to be done, not only back on farms and plantations, but while this is all happening, the Confederacy also has to stand up the industries required to sustain the war in the middle of it. And enslaved people fill much of that gap. A good example is at Richmond's Tredegar Iron Works. Parts of these structures also survive. In fact, they house the American Civil War Museum. If you've ever been there in Richmond, they're in these iron producing facilities. During the Civil War, Tredegar employs, by 1864, close to 600 to 700 enslaved laborers. Most of those people they rented or hired from slaveholders, but a growing percentage they purchased during the Civil War. And that's because as there's growing competition for enslaved labor, it incentivizes firms like Tredegar to rather than sort of run the risk of not being able to rent the people they need to operate, to buy them outright. And thus it is that in the fall of 1862, we see Tredegar buying an enslaved blacksmith named John. That he has a skill that is valuable to the firm, and they want to secure his labor. Tellingly, they don't just buy him, they also buy his family when they acquire him, which tells me that they want to make sure or to limit the possibility that he's going to run away during the war, that his work is so valuable to Tredegar, which supplies railroad ties, armored plating for ironclads, even artillery pieces to the Confederacy. His work is so valuable to them that they purchase him outright and then secure his family as well. Railroads. Railroads are critical to moving supplies, moving soldiers, moving everything required to the war. Railroads spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on enslaved people during the Civil War. Similarly, other Confederate industries, we could go through them all. They all buy enslaved people. Another one that stands out to me is there an Alabama coal mine. The owner of an Alabama coal mine goes to the Confederate government, excuse me, and asks the Confederate government to give him $75,000 with which to buy enslaved people. Part of this is because no one wants to rent people to coal mines. It's incredibly dangerous work. And so it's not a worthwhile slaveholders do not like to rent people to coal mines. The upheaval of the war, the transformations the war imposes on the Confederate economy, thus spur a great deal of slave trading. And individual Confederates adapt in similar ways. These are as numerous as the inhabitants of the wartime South, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. As the war grinds on, the Confederate military demands huge amounts of food from Confederates, and the Confederate infrastructure, especially their rail system, breaks down, which makes it hard to move food and other supplies around within the Confederacy. As a result, many slaveholders sell people whom they feel they can no longer feed, and use the money raised from this to support the people they retained. One South Carolinian reported that her neighbors were, and these are her words, quote, selling Negroes all the time to furnish support for the rest. This works on the inverse as well, however. Another South Carolinian took advantage of these sorts of sales and purportedly bought more than 100 people during the Civil War, whom he put to work on his property growing food that he could then sell to other Confederates, especially people in overcrowded cities like Charleston or Savannah. The other reasons for which Confederates acquired people are incredibly numerous, but I'll give you a couple of examples. There is a clause in the Confederate draft legislation that allows people, at least up to a certain point in the Civil War, to get out of the Army if they can find someone to take their place. Well, that is a problem if money is no good, and Confederate money virtually immediately is no good. So what you start to see as the war goes on is that Confederates who want to find a substitute have to offer would-be substitutes something they really want. It's not Confederate money. It turns out to be enslaved people. This image is an agreement in Rusk County, Texas between two men, and the price of the substitute is a enslaved girl about 16 years old named Charlotte. This is pretty common. You see these sorts of agreements all throughout the Confederacy, and in large part because it gets to the point, as another Texan said, that would-be substitutes won't even talk about money. They want real property, particularly enslaved people. Substitutes were, substitutes were unlikely to own slaves themselves, and this represents an opportunity to catapult themselves into the Southern elite, which one does by owning enslaved people. The Civil War also has a number of other effects. It disrupts households. As so many men go off to war, it transforms the homes that they leave behind. Women assume a great deal more responsibility. I think a lot about a letter I read where a husband tells his wife, "You have to be the husband and wife both now." And that gap in many cases is filled by acquired enslaved laborers. The wife has to do extra work and she demands an enslaved cook, an enslaved maid, an enslaved field worker to help share that responsibility. The reasons people buy people, though, cut in all sorts of different directions. One that I saw a surprising number of times, free Black families. Free Black families go to the slave market during the Civil War, in large part taking advantage of fluctuations, buying dips in the market, and using them to acquire their own family members, to secure them from slaveholders, so that they won't have to worry about losing them in a different kind of sale. So the wartime slave market creates, or the wartime slave trade creates all kinds of opportunities that cut in a lot of different directions. So we have the crises, the pressures that war applies to people. The second major reason Confederates engaged in the slave trade, we've already alluded to, but that has to do with emancipation. This is a map from a digital project run out of the University of Richmond. It's been down for repairs for a while, so I can't tell you to go look at it right now. But when it's up and running, it is another thing I commend to you. Each of the red dots represents what they call an emancipation event, someone trying to win free of slavery. You will see two things from this map. One, there are a lot of them. There are a lot of them. The second thing, though, is that they're largely concentrated in a few specific places. This represents two kind of divergent realities about emancipation during the Civil War. On the one hand, when the Civil War began, there were 4 million people enslaved in the United States. We think about 450,000 became free during the Civil War. That number may be as high as 800,000, but 400,000 to 500,000 is probably a better guess. That's a lot of people. But it also means that probably only between 15 and 20% of the enslaved population became free while the war was actually happening. And those are heavily concentrated in specific places, specifically, unsurprisingly, where the Union Army is. This means that Confederates still hold sway over most of the people and most of the territory where slavery was legal. And this means, what this means is that there are still plenty of places to which an enslaved person can be sold during the war. And that is a threat that slaveholders use to act as a check or to restrain people who are considering pursuing their freedom. This is a picture taken of Union forces with fugitives from slavery during the Peninsula Campaign. This is near Yorktown, Virginia. To prevent people from escaping, as so many people in this image clearly had, slaveholders threatened sale. A good example took place in eastern North Carolina, right in that cluster of red dots just north of the Outer Banks. There, Charles Pettigrew, who was one of North Carolina's largest slaveholders, caught wind that a number of the people he enslaved were thinking of running away. His answer was to concoct a plan to, as he put it, sell the ringleaders as a means of intimidating the other people who were thinking of fleeing into staying. And this is something that recurs over and over again throughout the Confederacy. Slaveholders threaten sale, which forces enslaved people to weigh the possibility of if they try to escape and fail, they stand an extraordinarily high chance of being sold. So it's something that, freedom might be beckoning only a few miles away, but if you don't make it, you're going to end up further away from your friends. You're going to end up further away from your family. And so it's a real calculation that enslaved people weigh. When enslaved people, as I said, try to run away and fail, they are more often than not sailed. Not far from here in King George County on the Potomac River, Confederate soldiers found a man named Moses standing in the river signaling to a Union gunboat. They pulled him out of the river, turned him over to his enslaver, who within a few days had him bound to Richmond for sale. Confederates are especially worried about people who have successfully run away and yet been recaptured. And this happens a lot during the Civil War. A woman named Candace down on the Virginia-North Carolina border escaped with her young child to a refugee camp on the North Carolina coast. Somehow, and I don't know how, the documents are opaque, somehow Confederates smuggled her out of this refugee camp. At some point in this process, her child died. We don't know exactly how, but instead of returning her home, they carried her to Richmond and sold her, fearing that she not only would run away, but might inspire others to do the same. This sometimes happens on an extraordinary scale. During the Gettysburg campaign, most famously, as the Confederate Army moves into Pennsylvania, Confederate soldiers and civilians following the army begin rounding up African Americans living in Maryland and southern Pennsylvania. We know that between 500 and perhaps as many as 1,000 people exit Pennsylvania and Maryland with the Confederate Army, and many of whom go to slave markets in Richmond, among other places. This happens all throughout the Confederacy. When Confederates invade Maryland in 62, Maryland and Pennsylvania in 64, Kentucky in 1862. In all of those moments, retreating when Confederates withdraw, they carry people with them and send them to slave markets. Another group likely to be sold, African American soldiers who fall into Confederate hands. Sometimes the Confederate, sometimes they never make it into the prisoner of war system. Sometimes Confederates extract them from the official POW system and sell them. And this functioned to reduce, this had sort of a practical purpose. It reduced the Confederacy's burden of soldiers, which it struggled to, of prisoners, which it struggled to manage as the war dragged on. It also helps affirm a rejection. The Confederacy always rejected, at least rhetorically, the idea that African Americans were legitimate combatants. On paper, at least, the Confederacy considered them slaves in rebellion. And sending them into the slave trade helps affirm this in the Confederate mind. So the slave trade provides Confederates with an active means of fighting emancipation. I should say sometimes this backfires. Sometimes this backfires. If enslaved people get wind or realize that they are likely to be sold during the war, it inspires people who would not otherwise have done so to escape. A good example is that the story of the man on the right, a man named William Andrew Jackson. William Andrew Jackson was enslaved in Richmond, where if his story is to be, if the story he tells about himself is to be believed, and I'm probably 60-40 that he's telling the truth, he was hired out and served as the personal coachman to Jefferson Davis. But in the spring of 1862, the person who owned him died, and he got wind that as a result, he was likely to be sold. So he holds a conference with his wife. He and his wife stay up late into the night discussing what they should do, and ultimately they make the shared decision that he should escape, which he does. It takes him a week, but he makes his way from Richmond to Fredericksburg, and like the people in the picture on the left, crosses the Rappahannock River into Union lines. This is another thing, though. This happens all throughout the wartime South. If you read Union soldiers' correspondence, you will regularly find them commenting that enslaved people, mothers, grandmothers, often with small children in tow, are arriving in their lines ahead of a threatened slave sale. So while the slave trade is a useful weapon against the threat of emancipation, it is a bit of a double-edged sword. But I think this shows the sort of the complicated nature of freedom as it unfolds during the Civil War. I want to suggest a third and final reason, and this was the most counterintuitive when I started to encounter it during my research, but quickly it was one of those things I was like, how did I not think about this before? The third and final thing I would suggest is that Confederates buy people during the Civil War for the simple reason that for most of the war, they think they're going to win, which seems obvious, again, but it's so hard for us to get out of the mindset of 2025 where we know what's going to happen and to remember they don't, and they think they're going to win. And this has two effects. I'll say this unfolds in two related but slightly different forms. Because the first is that because Confederates think that slavery is in the long term safe, that they think they're going to win and establish an independent slaveholding nation where slavery will be actively protected, they think that in this moment of instability, enslaved people are a relatively safe asset into which to put money. The second builds on this. There's a subset of Confederates who go beyond the idea of enslaved people as sort of a stable investment and see them as an incredibly promising speculation. They think that not only will slavery be safe, but it's going to skyrocket after the Civil War. This graph gives us a sense of why. The dates got cut off when I changed the format here. But what this represents is the price of several different commodities in the years leading up to the Civil War. And what you can see, this is about the year 1845. That top line where it says New Orleans is the average price of a person sold in New Orleans. The key thing here is that it had gone up in a virtually unbroken line for 15 years prior to the Civil War. And while some Confederates are convinced that this is a bubble, others think, well, as soon as this war is over, as soon as this aberration from our economy, as soon as it's over, that line is going to continue to go up. Both of these are present in Confederates' minds during the war. Let me talk just for a minute about enslaved people as an investment. I said earlier, the Confederacy experiences hyperinflation during the Civil War. All told, the Confederacy by 1865 will have undergone 7,000% inflation, which means that most Confederates have almost no faith in Confederate money from the beginning of the war. And as a result, they seek out real assets into which to invest money almost as soon as they get it on hand. Some want gold. There's not that much gold in the Confederacy, which leaves them with basically three options. You can invest in land, you can invest in cotton, or you can invest in enslaved people. People choose all of these things, but enslaved people have an advantage that the other two don't, which is to say you can't move land, and it's really hard to move cotton. And there's also basically no external market in cotton during the Civil War, whereas you can move enslaved people and you can sell them during the war. So as a result, many Confederates, I won't say all, I won't even say most, but a significant number of Confederates turned to enslaved people as an investment during the Civil War. Real estate and Negroes, a South Carolinian concluded, should be held by all who are not compelled by debts to sell, because when peace comes, they will have some value. You don't even have to have that high an opinion of the value of enslaved people to do this. As a future governor of Mississippi wrote during the Civil War, this is a quote, "Bad property as Negroes may be, they are still better than the money." So that's one attitude, right? One attitude that draws people to purchase enslaved people during the war. I should say this is the wartime exterior of 1315 Duke, coming back around to it. Not everyone has the means to do this. Not everyone has the inclination to do this. But enough Confederates take this attitude to ensure that hyperinflation can actually create a significant market for enslaved people during the Civil War. Others, however, go further. Especially people who are absolutely committed to the idea that the Confederates are going to win. I think a lot about a letter I read where a Confederate was writing back and forth with his father-in-law, and they're deciding what to do with the family's money during the war. And the son-in-law says, we should put it all in slaves. We should put it all in enslaved people. And he sort of concedes as an aside, like, yes, this doesn't make sense if we're going to lose. But he says, I don't even entertain that thought. I won't even entertain that thought. And there are a lot of people who think this way. And their attitude is essentially that when the war is over, enslaved people, the average enslaved person is sold for between $800 and $1,200 when the Civil War began. You see Confederates start to assume that the price will be $2,000, $3,000, even $4,000 or $5,000 when the war is over. They hold on to this idea for a really long time. In 1865, even as Sherman advanced through his home state, a South Carolinian argued to his family that they should buy an enslaved person. If we don't succeed, he wrote, the money won't be worth anything. And if we do, slaves will be worth 1,000 times more than now. The speculative impulse is a powerful one. This also shapes which enslaved people Confederates buy during the war. One of the things that surprised me as I was doing this research is the number of moments in which I saw Confederates specifically seeking out enslaved women and children. what this is significant because enslaved children certainly, and to a lesser degree enslaved women, are not going to produce a great deal of value in the short term. Children especially, to a lesser degree women. The reason you would a slaveholder would own a woman or own a child is that you own them for the long time horizon. That eventually enslaved children, and this is the sort of the naked economic logic, will pay off. The care will pay off the resources invested in their upbringing. Enslaved women have the same logic, except for under the laws that govern American slavery, slaveholders own not just enslaved women, but any children that they might have. And so enslaved women were, in essence, a way of producing what we would call generational wealth for slaveholders. And so when we see slaveholders targeting these people during the war, what that tells me is they're convinced slavery is around for the long haul. As one Virginian put it, if this war is ever ended fairly, women and children are the property to put money in. The slave market, in short, I'm arguing, allows Confederates to perform their faith in their overall project, to invest in the slaveholding future that they plan to build, and to demonstrate their commitment to establishing a nation based on enslavement. Now, as we know, this didn't work. We know this didn't work. But that doesn't mean it didn't have serious repercussions, particularly for people sold during the war. We could talk about a lot of different examples of this. It's not exactly going to match up with this ad, but it's roughly the same story. One of the most arresting moments I came across in my research was right after the Civil War. A delegation of abolitionists who were working actually in the 1315 Duke Street facility, including Julia Wilbur, a Quaker, go to Richmond to try to help people who had recently been enslaved there. And when they do, when they go to Richmond, one of the things they do is they tour Richmond slave trading sites, which had been active until only a few weeks before. They make multiple visits. They have a really interesting conversation with a man named Robert Lumpkin, whose facility you can visit the corner of. It's been excavated. Most of it is under I-95, but you can visit the corner of it. But on a different visit, Julia Wilbur visited the slave trading facility of the man mentioned in this ad, which is why I projected, Nathaniel Boosh Hill, who was, in addition to being a slave trader, a member of the Richmond City Council. She came to him because he had sold her during the war. And he had sold her as well as at least 2 of her children. Now, she had escaped and she ended up in Alexandria, but she didn't know where her children went. And she went and she begged Hill to give her any sense of where he might have sold her children. And he refused. He claimed later that his records had been destroyed during the war, which may or may not be true. It's very hard to tell. But the story, as this ad suggests, is a really common one. There are thousands of advertisements like this that come out in the years following the Civil War. Some, you continue to see them, especially in AME periodicals, into the 1890s in some cases. And I want to finish with a story that illustrates that. In late 1863, and I promise this is my last anecdote, there are so many that I think that I came across in my research, and I love to share them. But in 1863, a man named Richard Johnson, he was born in Talbot County, Maryland, just on the other side of the bay. He was enslaved on the same property where Frederick Douglass had grown up. I think his mother must have known Frederick Douglass, though no one ever mentions this. He enlisted in an African-American regiment raised in Maryland. And in the fall of 1864, he fought in one of a series of battles that took place before Richmond, where he disappeared. Army records listed him as missing in action, and his family assumed that he had died. His mother eventually draws a pension on his behalf. But Richard hadn't died. He'd been taken prisoner. At some point in early 1865, the Confederate government gave him over to one of the still active Richmond slave traders, who in turn sold him to a hotel keeper in Greensboro, North Carolina. After the Civil War was over, we don't exactly know why, Richard didn't go home, but kept moving south. At some point, he gets married, and he and his wife continue to move south until they're in Madison, Louisiana. He's kind of following work. His family thinks he is dead for the next 40 years. And the only reason they ever find out he's still alive is because eventually Richard applies for his own pension. And if the US government is good at anything in the 1890s, it is good at hunting out pension fraud. Because but I should say in the 1890s, the leading expenditure of the United States government is pensions to Civil War veterans. So pension investigators say, wait a second, someone already applied for this pension. Someone already drew this pension. And they start chasing down the details. And so what you end up with is this remarkable exchange of letters in 1907 between Richard Johnson and his brother, who we should note has a son named Richard. We could talk about this from any number of angles, but one of the things I want to suggest that when we talk about the freedom that came out of the Civil War, we talk about freedom, and it means a lot of different things. It's certainly for people coming out of slavery, it means an end to forced labor. It means control over their time. It means control over it means earning wages. But it goes much beyond that. And one of the core elements, one of the baseline elements for people emerging from slavery is that freedom means family. And at a minimum, the dislocation caused by the wartime slave trade meant that for many people, even the end of slavery, the demise of slavery, did not mean the freedom that they had expected or hoped for the most. And when we think about the Civil War, it is right, I think, to celebrate the freedom that the Civil War brought. But historians have been asking us to reconsider the costs of the Civil War in any number of terms, from the number of lives it cost to the ways that it changed the nation. And one of the things I think we need to think about is the effects, both psychological and otherwise, that the survival of the wartime slave trade had on people inhabiting the wartime South. So I'll finish there. I'm more than happy to take any questions you might have. Jim, I know, is going to circulate a microphone, but I thank you for your attention. Thank you for braving the traffic, the cold. It got much colder today, but I'd be happy to answer any question, or do my best, I should say, to answer any questions that you might have.
Do you know if Tula ever found a daughter again?
I don't. I know that these ads do sometimes work. I will just say that I would recommend there are two. Well, now there are two kind of wonderful books about this. Judith Giesberg runs a project out of Villanova. It has two different names: Last Seen or Information Wanted. Where they're building a database with these advertisements. And I can tell you that they often work. You do see newspaper stories that record the fact that people did find each other. But what's much more common, and you see this if you go into the Freedmen's Bureau records, for example, is that what all too often the story is Freedmen's Bureau agents say, basically, I asked around, I made an announcement in the local African-American church. I talked to the people who I thought might know something, and I can't find the people you're looking for. So that's all too often the reality. Yes.
So I have two questions.
Yeah.
So what made you interested in starting to study this, and how do your students in Mississippi receive it?
That's a good question. So I started this because, well, I was looking for a topic to research in the Civil War era. There were a bunch of books that had just come out about the domestic slave trade. Walter Johnson's book, River of Dark Dreams, Ed Baptist's The Half Has Never Been Told. And I'd read those, and I'd sort of noted in my head that they ended when the Civil War began. I was just sort of looking around in the University of North Carolina, where I did my graduate work, has fabulous Civil War era collections. And I started to just come across these transactions. And I thought, well, these don't seem to fit with the story that as I had read it. And it made me curious to pursue it. And as Ben's introduction suggests, I have been pursuing it for a very long time. I would say generally my students are pretty receptive of it. I'm not sure. They seem pretty receptive. I think I would say that it's a story that's new to many students. And so it's helpful. I like to sort of process the fact that the domestic slave trade, existed and extended for a long time with them. Yeah.
What was it like in the North in comparison in terms of inflation rate?
I can't give you an exact number. There is absolutely inflation in the northern states. In fact, this is an aside, but I'll mention it because I'm teaching it in my Civil War class next week. One of the things that we often forget about the Civil War is that for one, Abraham Lincoln thinks he's going to lose the election of 1864, and when he ultimately wins, but he only gets 55% of the vote. Right, 45% of the northern states vote against Abraham Lincoln, and a lot of that's because they don't feel that the war hadn't gone particularly well in the summer of 1864. But inflation is another major issue. The United States prints a paper currency, for a legal tender paper currency, which essentially is the precursor to the modern dollar that we have with us, if you are sort of a sadistic person and you read a lot about post-Civil War politics, the degree to which getting rid of paper money and getting wartime inflation under control is a dominant force in post-Civil War politics. Most people want to curtail the inflation that they had experienced. It's certainly the United States experiences double-digit inflation during the Civil War. I want to say 150%, but that would be me guessing based on not remembering, but it's significant. It's not comparable to the Confederacy, but it is significant. It's really hard on people in both sections. Yes.
Thanks a lot for your study of this subject matter. It seems as though there's a lot of information about economics, about dollars, things of that nature. With that in mind, what is the thought about looking at the whole idea of reparations and starting at the point that we're talking about in terms of the economics? That was obviously a very important part to the Confederates in terms of the value of the slave.
So it's a good question, and I will confess it's one I don't have a good answer for. Where I would sort of leave it is there are people who are doing really good work on this. One of the things that I will say is interesting is that after the Civil War, a whole variety of people believe that they will receive compensation or reparations after the Civil War. And that includes both formerly enslaved people and former Confederates who believe that emancipation is totally illegal and that they deserve to be compensated. I'll also note that we know that you may know that there is compensated emancipation in Washington, D.C. Slaveholders receive several $100s from most of the people enslaved in Washington, D.C. And Lincoln offers the same package to the border states who turn it down. So I don't have the question of reparations, I think, is so complicated as sort of a policy question that I can't say I can speak intelligently to it. What I can say, right, is that what I think my work shows is that there's a huge financial component to this. Yeah.
Since there's a question too about after Appomattox, it takes months for Confederate armies to finally give up. How long did the slave trade go beyond Appomattox?
So the latest official transaction that I have seen comes from the late summer of 1865 in Texas, which is after Juneteenth. Juneteenth is dates to the date that Union officers officially declared the end of slavery in Texas, but Texas is really big, and so it takes word to get out onto the plains. So I forget exactly when, but I want to say August 1865 is the last official transaction, last sort of documented transaction that I've come across. I will say you see rumors in Freedmen's Bureau records and newspaper articles that formerly enslaved people feel as if they are being purchased and sold in the sort of post-war post-war settlement where they have sort of year-long labor contracts. Sometimes they feel that those contracts are being sold, and they equate that a bit to the slave trade. I will say that one of the things that I found is that though, however else they feel about the post-war settlement, one of the ways in which enslaved people differentiate between what existed before the war, what existed during the war, and what's happening after the war is they say, basically whatever else happens, the slave trade is over. Freedom might not be everything that they had hoped it would be, but they rejoice in the fact that people cannot be bought and sold anymore, which I think is telling in many regards. Yes.
You mentioned that 80% of the men in the South were in the. Do you know what the percentage would be for the North, and also the relative size of the Union of the armies, the Union and the Southern?
So the United States has about 2.5 times as many military-aged men as the Confederacy does when the Civil War begins. I think the number is about half of the United States' military-aged men serve in the military. The United States does not mobilize to the same degree that the Confederacy does. About the numbers are pretty fuzzy, like surprisingly fuzzy. But our best guess is somewhere right around 2 million men served in the United States Army, and about 800,000 to 850,000 or so served in the Confederate Army. So a little over twice as many. Yes.
Does your research show when the owners of slaves in the South were thinking of that the war was going to go their way, did you get any evidence that they were considering a reunification with the United States itself, or were they all looking towards their own separate country, or did that even get discussed? Which direction it might
that
go?
Varies a little bit depending on where the person you're talking about is. For the most part, the assumption is that the Confederacy will be independent. There are if to the degree that you see a hope that the nation might reunite, it's generally people kind of on the border of the two sections. I was just talking to someone yesterday, and we were discussing, when Virginia secedes, right? Virginia has a 3-month, closer to 2 months, has a 2-month debate about whether or not to secede. And only 2 weeks before Fort Sumter, 2/3 of the state's secession convention had voted against seceding, right? But when you dig into it, for the most part, the people who are against secession are against secession because they believe slavery is safer within the Union than it is outside of the Union. That is to say that they make the case. And this phrase, I remember reading this phrase when I was an undergraduate looking at these debates, and it stuck with me. They make the case that by seceding, they give up the constitutional protections for slavery that they enjoy within the Union. The phrase that they use all the time in these debates, and this is the thing that stood out the most, is they say, if we secede, we bring Canada to the Potomac. That is to say, whereas within the Union, slaveholders in Virginia are protected by the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution and the Fugitive Slave Act passed by Congress. However much they resented, for example, Northern personal liberty laws, they still had those guarantees. But as soon as they act as an independent country, they believe, and as it turns out fairly quickly is true, the United States has if you're not going to buy into the Constitution, right, then you don't get constitutional protections. And so that is it. That's a major concern. So there are certain, I would say, once the war is on, you don't see a lot of that attitude. But there certainly are slaveholding unionists, especially in Kentucky and Maryland and Missouri. But as the war progresses, that tends to be sort of a diminishing number of people.
I
Yes.
have a process question for you.
Yeah.
You touched on it just a little bit, and I was hoping you could say a couple more words. As a historian type person, I find doing the kind of research projects about specific people or places or even historic events relatively easy to do. They're bounded.
Mhm.
Your collections are in one spot.
Mhm.
You know what date or what names to look for. It strikes me that you must have read every single letter and newspaper written during the Civil War to write this. Can you talk a little bit about how you just did some of this research?
Well, I will. So it's funny. I was. I've been driving a lot today. I started today in Charlottesville. I spent the day in Richmond, and now I'm here. But in Richmond, I was doing research at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, where I spent weeks while I was doing this project. And today, I found records of wartime slave sales that I'd never seen before. Right. So so to your point, well, one of the reasons I think no one has looked at this topic before is because there are very few people in the United States or the Confederacy who spend all or even most of their time thinking about the slave trade during the Civil War, right? And so there are almost no collections that have that as their focus. But what I found as I started to read Civil War letters and diaries, once you start looking for it, once my antennae went up, and I was like, this is something I should pay attention to. I started to find pieces of it in, I won't say all or certain, maybe even most of the collections that I looked at, but a great many of them had at least a reference to the slave trade. Often that would be a line in a letter where between a Confederate soldier and his family, you know, sort of discussing what to do about a specific enslaved person. And that might be it. But I read enough letters and I read enough diaries, I read enough, you know, newspaper articles, military documents, whatever, right? That eventually common threads started to show up. And so, yeah, I mean, it was really a sifting process. I wish that I had counted how many of these collections I spent time in. I think I went to or got materials from 20 or 25 or 30 different archives at some point. So it really was. I think of it. I think of it a lot as a mosaic, right? Finding little pieces everywhere that are scattered around, and then just trying to put them together. I will say also. I already mentioned, for example, Judy Giesberg's Last Seen project. I benefited enormously from the digitization of materials. I will plug one other project that was hugely helpful. The Smithsonian, through its transcription site, is hosting an ongoing transcription project in Freedmen's Bureau records. Freedmen's Bureau records are incredibly voluminous. I think there's about 8 million pages of documents from the Freedmen's Bureau is a government agency set up to help people transition from slavery to freedom. Does so very imperfectly, but it does an extraordinary amount of work. The problem is these documents are incredibly difficult to use because of the way that they're filed, basically. But this transcription project means all of a sudden you can search for names. You can search for people across, you know, what would have previously been entirely different. You know, you would have, back in the day when they served these boxes at the National Archives, you would have had to get maybe a dozen different boxes to trace somebody through, or more recently, you know, 3 or 4 different reels of microfilm. Well, now you can search through the database. It's incomplete, but I know they're always looking for people to take part. And the stories that come out once you can start tracing people, as you mentioned, Ben, are really remarkable. Yeah. So I will plug the Freedmen's Bureau transcription project as well. Yes.
I'm sure the narrative shifted in terms of what was published in abolitionist literature during the war. Did you, in your primary sources, catch a sense of a change of conscience in people dealing in the trade of enslaved people during the war in the South or the Confederate areas?
That's a good question. I would say not really. There is an interesting literature that historians haven't really looked at in a while that suggests that Confederates, particularly of a religious bent, thought that one way of adapting or late in the Civil War, there are Confederates, particularly sort of devout Christians, who see the war and its turn against them as sort of divine punishment. And one of their answers is to try to reform the institution of slavery, which is an impulse that excuse me, sweeps through the antebellum South periodically. I can't say, and one of those things tends to be focusing on the domestic slave trade as sort of this particularly abhorrent form of enslavement. That said, one of the things that had been happening before the Civil War is that white Southerners had begun already sort of psychologically distancing themselves and rhetorically distancing themselves from the slave trade, essentially arguing that the slave trade existed, yes, but it was something that nobody particularly liked. It was practiced by social outcasts, and it wasn't something that most slaveholders participated in anyway, right? So they're already saying that in the decades before the Civil War, and that's because it is it is the most obvious and most frequently attacked portion of the institution of slavery by abolitionists. And so abolitionists, one of the things that the Civil War does is it gives abolitionists access to the American South. The state of Georgia, for example, had put a bounty on William Lloyd Garrison's head in the 1830s. And so it was not safe. William Lloyd Garrison comes to Charleston in 1865. He's thrilled about this. He makes a meal out of it. But there are journalists and there are anti-slavery activists traveling with the army. And one of the things that they do, and one of the things that one of the major things that I was able to find in newspapers, particularly, is they talk all the time about encountering the domestic slave trade, encountering facilities like the slave pen in Alexandria, but all throughout the South. And for them, they drive this home to make the case that this is what the war is about. This is what the war is about. Does the entire United States population buy that? No, not really. But it is part of sort of a larger shift that at least makes emancipation a major part of the United States' war aim. So it is a major rhetorical focus during the Civil War. I can't say I see dramatic shifts. For abolitionists, it's a lot of them saying, see, what we've been telling you for 30 years is absolutely true, and here's the evidence to prove it.
I'm sure you're familiar with the novel James, which is the Huckleberry Finn story from Jim's point of view. At the very end, there's a horrifying scene in what is called a breeding farm. In your research, is that urban legend? Did that really happen on any scale?
You're talking about, so the phenomenon of slave breeding? It's a hard one to pin down. What I would say is that, so there is anecdotal evidence that it happened. And, you know, the antebellum South is big enough that I'm sure that it did. The place you see it the most anecdotally is in the WPA narratives recorded with formerly enslaved people who mention it occasionally in their recollections of slavery. What I would say is this: I have almost never found slaveholders referencing it explicitly. That said, slaveholders are very much aware that they benefit from the growth of the population of the growth in the number of people that they enslave. And so, you know, how actively is this pursued? It's hard to say, but it's something that people are aware of, right? You know, Thomas Jefferson in his farm books says that he gains the value of the people he enslaves increases by 4% per year, partially by rising prices, but partially because he has more enslaved people every year. So that kind of attitude, slaveholders know that they benefit. It's just a question of how explicit are they about it.
One of the journalists to write effectively on the slave economy just prior to the war was Frederick Law Olmsted for the New York Times.
Yes.
I've always found does that taught much in Civil War history? Or?
Yeah. So Frederick Law Olmsted writes a handful of books in the 1850s about traveling through the South. He has one where he kind of goes along the Atlantic coast, and then one where he goes all the way to Texas. He writes 2 books. He encounters the slave trade a number of times in those books, and those descriptions are fairly accurate. And they are fairly well known when the Civil War begins. So Certainly, yes. So I would say yes. Historians are well aware of them. One thing I would say is that he observes things and he comments on them that on things that were sort of long like brushed aside or people didn't really think that much about. Historians didn't think all that much about the domestic slave trade until at least the 1950s, for a variety of reasons we could talk about. And interestingly, it's not until the 1990s or not late 1980s that scholarship on it really takes off. It doesn't fit super well with a number of the sort of major themes that historians are exploring about slavery in the 60s and 70s, and so it doesn't get a lot of attention. But some of the things, as historians, I won't say rediscover, but paid renewed attention to the slave trade in the 80s and 90s, one of the things that they picked up on is, Frederick Law Olmsted actually got a lot of this stuff right, and we should pay attention to the way that he talks about it. Yeah. Yes.
Question in terms of historians focusing in on various parts of slavery. The thought process of what allowed a group of people who left a country looking for religious freedom, coming to another country, and then thinking that at that point in time it's okay to enslave when they come from a Christian background, where all life was sacred. Any thought or any scholarship about that change and how that came about, and how that might impact people today?
Yeah. So this is a huge question, right? The question of where does the enslavement, particularly of people from African descent, where does it come from? Is a huge question, and I would recommend. I think. David Bryan Davis does a really good job with this in a number of books. He has a series called "The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture," "The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution," "The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Emancipation." But he has a much shorter book called "Inhuman Bondage" that is excellent. I would say, and I say this not as sort of any sort of defense, but I read a really interesting article. Sort of making, 5 years ago when the 1619 Project came out. And it was sort of gently making the point that, we talk about 1619 as the year when enslaved people arrive in the English colonies in North America. And this author who wrote a really good book on sort of slavery in English thought, sort of gently pointed out that enslaved people lived in what is now the United States. Enslaved people of African descent had been in what is now the United States 100 years earlier, since the 1520s. And so this is a long process. There are, we could have a much longer conversation about this, but slavery has existed. One of the things that David Bryan Davis points out is that, when at the time of the American Revolution, slavery is legal from Canada to Chile, as he puts it. It's legal everywhere. The degree to which it is something that had been practiced nearly universally, I think is something we often overlook. That's not in any way intended to be an excuse, but to show, I think, in some ways, like that this is a remarkable century-long fight for freedom that takes place from the American Revolution period all the way through to the Civil War, and not just in the United States, but in the Western Hemisphere as a whole. Yeah, so there is a long literature, right, on slavery and race in antebellum Virginia, and Becky Getz is an interesting book in that regard. Yeah.
I'd like to thank Dr. Robert Colby for coming.
Thank you very much.